And before we begin, we'd just like to acknowledge that this is stolen land, that right now we're participating
in the United States, and we need to uphold the rights of indigenous peoples, and we can do that. About a few weeks ago, I went up to Burnaby, BC, at the Kinder Morgan site, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation was holding a rally and invited anyone to come. And it was a really powerful experience for me to be able to see tribal leaders from Canada and the United States coming together under one message. I had never really gone to a rally or considered myself an activist before, but then once I actually stepped on the ground and marched and stood for what I believed in and saw the struggle of that's not going to be easy, and that this is going to be a lifelong fight. There's so much going on, and there's so many different things that we can focus on, but I'd like to talk about our immediate surroundings. I don't know if y'all saw the tanker that was traveling up the strait, but that boat was going all the way to Alaska. So we have to realize the significance and the impacts of all these different things that are going on. The marine boats that are affecting the mammals. Then there's the Ferndale refinery, which is one of the largest refineries in the area. And this movement of First Nations protecting their land is not a new thing, and it's also a worldwide movement. People from all around the world are now considering landforms, like rivers, lakes, and mountains. Those all have rights in the eyes of certain people. And it's important to acknowledge that while this place might be beautiful, it's not only that, it's actually sacred to some. And the species that we see all around us are also considered spiritual and more significant than really I can describe. From out of 50 of the most important species that the coastal Salish consider important, 24 of them were listed as endangered or at risk. And I think that we can, use science and education if we can collaborate with the tribal nations.
Using this broad topic of activism, which we could talk about for days and days and days, and I hope that we do. And we want to engage, because we think it's important as environmental educators, and for most of us as the descendants of settlers and the settlers ourselves, it's important to include activism, however that looks like to you, in our work and in the education that we do. And so we wanted to explore activism because activism there's not one way to do it. As we all know, there are so many forms of activism. I mean, really, any act that you take that you think is aligned with a belief system that you have, or you're defending something that's important to you, or you're speaking up for something that you think is important, that can be activism. And I want to explore that with you all so that we can be inspired and we can have a greater awareness of like what we have the power to do and what we don't. And again, we're sort of taking the lens of the local activism against transnational pipelines, oil pipelines, which are not, I want to frame again, not inherently wrong. I want to respect the many viewpoints about these issues, but that have been raised as sort of, really important, critical junctures in our history and in how we manage resources and protect sovereign nations and respect the ecosystem and our ecological relations as well as our human relations. And so, briefly, Austin shared his experience with activism and sort of his has anyone here had any experience with activism or had a profound or maybe not so profound, but just sort of realization or experience that sort of changed how you think about activism, or you think would relate to sort of this, yeah.
Yeah, like something that I thought of when you were sharing, Austin, about
hummingbird, sorry.
Shiny throat patch, which you can see more in certain light. Okay.
I just wanted to share something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of like this intersection between being an educator and thinking about social justice through a lot of things that classes in the ESJ minor has helped me think about, which is predominantly run and taught by like professors of color, and like their a lot of the knowledge that they bring, and just being really critical about these like words that we throw around, or not critical, but trying to like think more deeply about like the words we use and how just it's so hard to really understand what someone's talking about sometimes in this conversation, that it's people say this one thing because it's the thing to say, and it's like, it sounds really great, and I struggle with that so much, and like as we're trying to learn and understand. But what I was going to say is really trying as for me, like in becoming an educator and being in classes around social justice education, thinking about the root and beginnings of public education within the United States, and how a lot of public education was started as Native boarding schools, which a lot of us know had extremely violent histories of erasure, and that as teachers, like going into maybe communities of color, how we're not, you can't say for everyone, but how like we're all contributing to these things, and that like diving into the history and really trying to understand perspectives, it has been really important for me, and it's hard. Like for me, the ways that I learn, I really struggle with just like reading things and understanding information that way, but just really like as we like go forward as educators, trying to understand the complexity of our public education system and private education system, and who it's for, and like who has access to it, and do the ways we convey information is that obtainable for certain people. So I don't know, that I kind of forgot what you asked, but that has been a really pivotal thing for my education, of just historicizing the idea of schooling versus education, and the violences that schooling has enacted on many, many people.
Thank you, that's so significant.
Also, activism work, and also how the two things can be and should be like combined. Like you should be working activism work into your education, but being like really conscious of how you do it.
Environmental and sustainability matters. We have entered an age whereby human impact is approaching many ecological system boundaries, such as freshwater usage, atmospheric pollution, and extinction of species. The current state of environmental education in Canada is inadequate to address these challenges and empower citizens to understand the complexity of the issues and take effective action. And the Government of Canada should provide coherent national leadership in environmental and sustainability education, and recognize the importance of Indigenous knowledges and practices in the education of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. We, the undersigned citizens and residents of Canada, call upon the House of Commons and Parliament assembled to 1. Take a leadership role in enacting a Canadian strategy that supports educators, communicators, community leaders, as well as provincial and municipal governments to take actions that result in healthy, sustainable, and flourishing human and ecological communities, and 2. Recognize fresh air, clean drinking water, and healthy food as being human rights for all Canadians. And then it was sponsored by Elizabeth May, who is the head of the Green Party for Canada and sits in the House of Parliament. and was just recently arrested at the very same thing that Austin was at. So imagine a person who is elected to sit in government going to the front lines and voluntarily being arrested, and signed by thousands of people across Canada. And so what that did, that little act of advocacy that I created, forces the government to respond and creates a conversation. And there might be hundreds of petitions written and read every month in Canada, but it is just one of the ways that we can engage in advocacy.
That is so powerful. Thank you.
I think it's our everyday lives of how easy it is to just turn on the switch or turn on your car, and the real impact behind that. But at the same time, we can't only focus on the negatives, and that can seem so much, especially at the time of our lives that we're at, all the transitions and kind of pressures. So whatever it is to you that makes you an activist, go with that. If that means tying yourself up to a pipeline, then do it. If that means sharing something on Facebook, do that. 800 people might see it. It can be so simple, or it can be a lifelong ambition of yours. Some certain local things going on that I want to point out, that I think this group could kind of latch on to. There's the Washington Carbon Emissions Fee and Revenue Allocation Initiative, 1631, also known as the carbon tax. It hasn't been passed though, so we would be charging the polluters for what they're doing, and at the same time creating like other clean, renewable energy jobs. They need volunteers to get signatures, to get the initiative on the ballot. I know someone as well. Her name is Kiara Rose, and she's a very powerful person and very dedicated to the Pacific Northwest in general. And I don't know if you remember a few years back when the Shell oil rig was in the Puget Sound, she actually tied herself up to the Shell oil rig for about 60 hours. And just, that means so much, and it makes news on international headlines. And even if, even if there's not really that much change, it's the thought of change, and it's the inspiration for others to see that action, and then, oh, maybe I can actually do something about it too, and go to a rally, or share something on Facebook, or write letters to your congressman. Kiara is starting a campaign to run for the 42nd seat of this Washington State Legislature. She will need a lot of help to get elected, but she's more than qualified. So I think that could be another thing that this group could kind of latch on to, as far as volunteering our time, which I think time is one of the most valuable things in life that we can give. So I just wanted to leave with those thoughts, and I want to encourage this discussion to move forward, kind of like what we did last week with our random act of kindness. And can we move that forward to kind of a spring block long project? And that could look a number of different ways. It could be an art gallery, or it could be getting the clubs on campus together to talk and form some sort of steps and to move forward.
you all to really ask yourself, what does it mean to be an activist? How can I be an ethical, and especially when trying to support sovereign nations and marginalized groups? I would love to have a conversation, because I genuinely want to learn how to be a better activist and how to be a better supportive ally as a white cisgender descendant of, well, as a settler. And I'd also like to ask, just to keep this in your mind, and I would genuinely love, like, in maybe our free time or later today or whenever, have a conversation as well about what do we, and when I say we, I'm sorry, I should say do I, representing people who are from my background of, white, settler, privileged people, because not all of our group is made up of that community, or that ancestry. Do I have more of a duty to physically put myself on the line? Do I have more of a duty to act as a voice for marginalized groups, or to advocate for what they want because of my heritage and because of my role in society right now? And that's not a loaded question. I genuinely want to dig into these, because I think that they're so intertwined with our work and with the history of our work, which has not been geared towards everyone, and has been a tool of oppression as well as a tool of liberation.